The end of an era for Cuba, a new president, and for the first time in nearly 60 years, his name is not Castro. Will Miguel Diaz-Canel bring real change, and how will it affect U.S.-Cuba relations? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Fuli Batibo. Who will succeed the Castros, Fidel and Raul, has been the subject of intense speculation in Cuba for decades. Well, we now know. Miguel Diaz-Canel has been elected as president by the National Assembly, taking over from 87-year-old Raul. His nomination as the head of the 31-member Council of State was officially confirmed on Thursday. He will serve a 5-year term. But Raul Castro is expected to continue playing a big role in policy decisions. He'll remain the head of the ruling Communist Party until 2021. So, how much power will Miguel Diaz-Canel actually exercise? We'll get to our guests in just a moment, but first, our Latin America editor Lucia Newman has more on Cuba's new president.
Tall, serious, efficient, and above all, discreet. Rising up the Communist Party's ranks from the bottom, 57-year-old Miguel Diaz-Canel is making history. He's done it in part by never ever having tried to outshine or question Fidel or Raul Castro, as others once earmarked as their successors learned the hard way.
And I think they also feel he's extremely loyal, extremely patriotic, that he actually genuinely believes in the Cuban Revolution.
As the Communist Party secretary of his home province of Villa Clara, Diaz-Canel earned a reputation for being open-minded. The Menjunje is a hangout for young people, including gays, lesbians, transsexuals, and punks. Diaz-Canel was by their side in the 1990s when alternative lifestyles were severely frowned on.
Even after he rose to the top, every time he came to Santa Clara, one of the first things he'd do was come see us at the Menjunje. He's the same unassuming, humble person.
Maybe so, but in most of Cuba, people know very little about the first man in 6 decades who will rule this island, whose name is not Castro. In fact, he was the only candidate in the vote by the National Assembly on Wednesday. We asked this man what he thought of the selection process.
Let my silence speak for itself. It's the silence of many Cubans.
Those who may be expecting a major shift will clearly be disappointed.
We are encouraging, reaffirming and consolidating continuity, which is very important for the defense of the revolution, which today is being threatened and attacked by a relationship with the US that has deteriorated.
The truth is that Diaz-Canel has been chosen not to reform, but to improve Cuban socialism, if he can. And while he does represent a generation younger than that of the Castros, he will have to answer to a power much higher than his own, the Cuban Communist Party. Lucia Newman, Al Jazeera, Havana.
Well, let's bring in our guest for today's Inside Story. In Havana, Cuba, Carlos Alzugare, former Cuban ambassador to the European Union. In Santa Fe, in the U.S., Vicky Huddleston, former U.S. Chief of Mission in Havana. And in Washington, D.C., Andrew Otazo, Executive Director of the Cuba Study Group. Thank you all for being with us today on Al Jazeera. If I can start with you, Carlos Alzugare in Havana. For the first time in 60 years, the president of Cuba is not a Castro. Just how big a moment is this for Cubans, and does it represent change in any way?
Well, this is a very important moment, but it is a moment that for which the Cuban system has been preparing. The Cuban president, Raul Castro, initiated this process of preparing the way for a new leadership to arrive. And he's doing it in a gradual way. As we could see yesterday, a couple of the historic leaders of the revolution, of the historic guerrillas, remain in the Council of State. So, but this is historic. It is the government and the party are emphasizing continuity, but I would say that it's change in continuity. The reason for that is that if there is no change, probably there cannot be any continuity. So this is a dialectical process in which a new leadership is taking over, a leadership of people who were born and raised in a country embargoed by the United States, but also in a country that at the time when they were young adults had enjoyed a socialist system that worked.
Okay.
Worked to a great extent because the Soviet Union subsidized it, but worked. So this is what is happening.
Do you say change in continuity, sir? You say change in continuity.
Documents that would design the process are already in place. So now it's a question of implementation.
Okay, let me just pick up on what you said there. You talked about change in continuity. Do you think do you expect the new president to uphold the Castro ideology?
Of course, no doubt about it. One of the characteristics of Mr. Diaz-Canel is his loyalty to the revolution. But remember this, Fidel Castro was successful because he accomplished what many Cubans wanted to be accomplished. The old ideas, the old ideals of independence, a fair country, education, health for all these were ideals that are part of the ideals of the Cuban Revolution, but they are embedded in the Cuban nation, in the identity of the Cuban nation. You can trace it back to José Martí, the great Cuban political leader and poet of the end of the 19th century. He basically formulated what the country is now. There is a problem, though. The problem is that the economy is not working as it should be, and it's fundamental for the continuity of the process that the economy be changed.
We will indeed touch on those challenges in just a few minutes, including the economic challenges. But I want to get Vicky Huddleston's view in Santa Fe first before we get to the priorities for this new Cuban president. Vicky, what type of president do you think Miguel Diaz-Canel will be? Do you expect any drastic changes in direction?
Well, absolutely no drastic changes in direction. Diaz-Canel has to satisfy the whole party. He has to satisfy Raul Castro, who remains the head of the Communist Party. The tragedy is that this is a historic opportunity. And if the United States weren't threatening, if the Trump administration hadn't returned to a punitive policy, then I think Diaz-Canel would have more opportunity to institute and expand reforms.
People who followed his career say he's a pragmatic politician, a seasoned politician. But do you think he'll be able to impose his will on the various factions of the Cuban government?
I think he'll have to start out very slow. He'll have to show that he can manage this government. He'll have to satisfy, as I say, Raul Castro. But for his own credibility and for the success of the Cuban nation, he will have to institute reforms because the Cuban economy has serious troubles now.
Okay. Andrew Ortazo in Washington, D.C., your parents are Cuban. You were born and raised in the United States. I'm curious to know what the view is from the Cuban-American community about this new leader. Do they see it as representing a sense of renewal or more of the same?
Well, I have to say that, first of all, I don't think the Cuban-American community, just like any other ethnic or racial community in the United States or elsewhere, speaks in one voice. But I think by and large, they're pretty clear-eyed about the new leader. We don't expect any great transformational change. And I echo everything the ambassador just said, in that there doesn't seem to be any drastic change on the horizon, although in order to maintain his legitimacy, which he doesn't have because of, for example, fighting La Sierra during the Batista years, he has to do something in order to keep the economy afloat.
Do you think he'll have the same popular backing as the Castros?
No, he doesn't have, again, he doesn't have the legitimacy of the Castro brothers. He does not have the pull that they had historically or within the different centers of power in Cuba. He came up through the Communist Party apparatus rather than have his power base in, say, the military or the security apparatus.
Okay. Well, let's talk about some of the challenges the new president faces. The biggest challenge, as you heard there from our guests, are economic. Latest figures show unemployment at just under 3%, but earnings remain low. The government's the main employer, and state salaries average $30 a month. Reforms to boost private enterprise introduced by Raul Castro have been accompanied by cuts in subsidies and pensions. Though tourist arrivals have doubled in 10 years, imports have dropped from $15 billion in 2013 to $10 billion in 2016, making goods and products more scarce. And Cuba has a dual currency system that distorts the economy. One is used to pay wages and local goods, and the other in tourism and foreign trade. Unifying the two would raise the price of imports. So, Carlos Alzugaray in Havana, what do you see as the main economic challenge for the new president? What should be his first priority in dealing with the unstable economy that Cuba has been faced with?
Well, what he has to achieve is already in the design. The three main documents that the National Assembly and the Central Committee of the Cuban Communist Party have adopted over the last 5 years, the guidelines for the updating of the Cuban economic model, this conceptualization of the Cuban economic model, and the task or the vision for 2030. Now the government is working in another document that would be a more, let's say, a more detailed document about 2030. So these are the guidelines. The guidelines are there. Basically, it is transforming the Cuban economy from a totally centralized state-owned economy to a mixed economy with an important role for the private sector. And secondly, make the decentralization of the Cuban state enterprise system in a way that will facilitate the modernization and efficiency of that system. Now, on these two issues, which are the main guidelines, the main things that have to be done, obviously, it hasn't worked. And the Central Committee of the Communist Party had a plenum about a month ago.
Right.
It was very self-critical, and it pointed out that something had to be done. So we'll have to see. Now, a lot of focusing is taking place on Diaz-Canel, but I invite people to focus on the proposal for the new vice president. Valdez Mesa. Valdez Mesa is a guy who comes from the workers' movement, who was a labor leader, he's about my age. He also was Minister of Labor, so he has experience on that front, which would be one of the things that one could point out that Diaz-Canel lacks, which is the experience in the workings of the Cuban economy.
Okay.
Then we have to see what's going to happen in the Council of Ministers.
Okay.
My suspicion is that the Council of Ministers is going to be restructured, and what role is Murillo, Vice President Murillo, will take, because he's now not in the Council of State. But I suspect there is going to be a redesign of the Cuban institutional process.
Okay.
Process playing the role they have to play.
Let's get Vicky Harrelson's view on this, the economic challenges. Vicky Harrelson, lots of challenges ahead for this new president. How do you see him tackling the complex dual currency system while at the same time making sure that inflation doesn't rise for ordinary Cubans? What should he be doing to tackle this issue?
I think he has a huge job on his hands, and I think it's extremely difficult. The Cuban government just said that they were not moving forward with the unification of the dual currency, and this really is critical to attract foreign investment. What I fear is that the Cuban government has done a wonderful job in preparing for a succession, but are they going to give this new generation of leaders who don't have the same credibility as the revolutionary leaders, the space they need to undertake these economic reforms? And it's beginning to look like they're afraid of doing that. Raul Castro himself was not able to do it.
Right.
His reforms remain incomplete, and in fact, he's pulling them back.
Right. Andrew Otazo, Vicky Harrelson makes an interesting point there when she says, you know, this new president was born after the revolution. He has no military history. How do you think he'll be able to establish his legitimacy when he doesn't have the same moral authority as a historic generation of revolutionary leaders?
That's an open question that has yet to be decided. He's going to have to bring in stakeholders from all the centers of power within the Cuban government and get the buy-in of the Cuban people, which is no easy task. He will have to prove his own worth as a new head of state. And, you know, the wet foot, dry foot policy was abolished at the end of Obama's term, so there isn't that safety valve to release pressure, internal pressure within Cuba, should there be dissatisfaction. So that's going to get pent up, and it all boils down to whether or not he can govern in an effective manner, whether or not he can direct the economy and fix the disaster that's currently being felt by the Cuban people. And again, a lot of this has to do not just with what happens within Cuba, but also U.S. policy, because at the end of the day, the Cuban government can implement whatever reforms they like, but 90 miles offshore is one of the most powerful and largest economies in the world. So if the United States does not, you know, continues to enact a policy of isolating Cuba, then really whatever reforms are implemented will not be felt to full effect on the island.
Yeah, well, where do you see these relations with the U.S. going? I mean, the recent Trump appointments don't bode well for U.S.-Cuba relations, do they?
No. No, whether that be at the State Department or the National Security Council, no. I don't see any real improvements on the horizon. The fact of the matter really is that in the United States, the Cuba policy has been subbed out to hardliners in Congress, Cuban-American representatives to be more specific, and they're really driving this, and I don't see that changing anytime soon.
Okay, Carlos Arzulage, your thoughts on the evolution of U.S.-Cuba relations, the improvement in relations which began under Barack Obama have been partially reversed since Donald Trump entered the White House. Do you see them getting worse now with this new Cuban leader?
Well, obviously, Mr. was reversing everything that Obama did. He has actually not done that. I think there is a consensus in the United States for a majority of people inside the government, outside the government, in business, in the agricultural sector, in some states that are in Republican hands, that it makes sense to continue having a normalization process. So you see a kind of a weird situation. Trump has diminished, has drawn down the embassy in Havana, which I think is a big mistake that damages the regular Cubans. It doesn't damage that much the Cuban government, but it damaged the Cuban government. But it damages United States interests because they don't have as effective a listening post in Havana as they could have if there was an embassy here. I imagine a lot of people at the State Department, at the CIA, and some other at the Pentagon say, come on, we need to have people on the ground. And we have people on the ground to know what's happening and also to influence the new guys. The new guys were both raised embargo by the United States. So this is the new leadership has to be approached in a very careful manner from the point of view of U.S. interest. Now, I think Trump is, the Trump policy is an anomaly. And I think it will be abandoned at some point in time, even by Trump himself, or eventually by the next president. Of course, we don't know when that's going to happen.
Right.
I think the strategy of the Cuban government should be basically to make the economy work, even with the U.S. embargo on. And that would give a signal that the embargo is useless.
Vicky Harrelson in Santa Fe, your thoughts on the future of U.S.-Cuban relations. Do you see the normalization process resuming, or is that forgotten about now? Relations are only going to get worse.
Relations are only going to get worse. John Bolton, the new National Security Director, has always been a hardliner on Cuba. He accused Cuba of having biological agents that Cuba was sharing with rogue nations. This was untrue, but he did it in order to sabotage President Carter's trip to Cuba. So we can expect him to try to roll back further the travel of Americans to Cuba. Mike Pompeo, if he becomes Secretary of State, criticized President Obama's trip to Cuba and said it promoted dictatorship. So I think we should be very, very worried that we're moving back toward a hostile policy. As Andrew said, President Trump has turned Cuba policy over to the hardliners led by Senator Marco Rubio in the U.S. Senate. So this is a problem, especially since Cuba has always had a mentor, an ally that provides support and subsidies, such as the Soviet Union and then Venezuela. So now, once again, Cuba is looking for that mentor, for that nation that can subsidize its economy, and it's looking toward Russia, which is providing it with petroleum and has taken over, initialed an agreement to take over the management of the Cienfuegos petroleum refinery. And also China, which is Cuba's major trading partner, greater than the EU. So these are things the United States should worry about. We are pushing Cuba toward Russia and China rather than helping Cuba and its people expand their business and their possibilities and bring it closer to the United States.
Andrew Otazo, I want to get your thoughts on Cuba's role and position in the wider Latin America region. This transfer of power comes at a precarious time in Cuba's history. Cuban allies in Latin America have been voted out of government positions across the region in recent years. What impact do you see this new leadership having on Cuba's position within the region?
Well, going back to the early 2000s, Cuba was the leader of the so-called pink revolution in Latin America, whether that be Hugo Chavez in Venezuela or Bolivia, Nicaragua, Argentina, Brazil. But things have changed drastically since then. Many of the more leftist governments in Latin America have either been kicked out of power or been voted out. And Cuba just doesn't find itself in the same position that it used to be. Its main benefactor, Venezuela, is going through an economic implosion currently. And it's like the ambassador said, Cuba's looking to other countries for support because its economic system, ever since the revolution, has been based on an outside patron that is able to subsidize the rest of the economy. So things have really changed since then. Really, right now, Cuba still holds a lot of the imagination of Latin American governments,
right,
but it really doesn't have the same, I'd say, influence in the rest of the region that it used to have.
Okay, let me get Ambassador Arzugale to give us the final word on where he sees Cuba heading next within the region. Do you see Cuba regaining some of this lost influence?
Well, I don't think Cuba has lost influence in Latin America. The influence of Cuba in Latin America has been important and significant because sometimes it is thought that Cuba has only a relationship with the left-wing forces. Now, Cuba was smart enough to have a relationship with all political forces in the region that were not totally hostile to Cuba. That can be President Santos in Colombia, that can be Macri himself in Argentina, that can be Calderón in Mexico, now Peña Nieto. I think Cuba has been very smart. The influence in Cuba in Latin America is even in the cultural field. For example, Cuba has two initiatives that have worked very well over time, which is the Casa de las Americas, which is a central point of development of continental culture in the region, and also the Festival of the New Latin American Cinema. These are elements of a policy that is very wide-ranging,
okay,
and that has maintained Cuba as an actor. On the other hand, I agree with Andrew. The imagination of Latin America has been caught up by the Cuban Revolution, and many people, even if they are right-wing, they sympathize with Cuba.
Thank you so much, Ambassador Carlos Alzugare, Vicky Huddleston, and Andrew Otazo for a very interesting discussion on the future of Cuba. And thank you as well for watching. You can watch this program anytime by visiting our website at aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. And of course, you can also join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle is at AJ Inside Story. From me, Foli Batibo, and the whole team, thank you for watching. Bye for now.